Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of chatting with Dr. Meagan Pollock. Meagan envisions a world where personal and social circumstances are not obstacles to achieving potential and where kindness, inclusivity, and conservation prevails. An international speaker, teacher, engineer, and equity leader, her mission is to provide services, tools, and resources that inspire awareness and initiate action. Meagan's company, Engineer Inclusion, helps people intentionally and systematically engineer equity and inclusion into their organizations, driving positive outcomes and effectively supporting employees and the community. She provides teaching, consulting, and development services related to engineering, education, and equity to industry, nonprofit organizations, and educational institutions across the globe. A storyteller at heart, Meagan connects with audiences through her authentic style and her ability to facilitate tough conversations. Since 2018, Meagan serves as the chair of the Professional Development Committee for the American Society for Engineering Education Commission on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and she's incoming chair-elect. In addition, she's an associate fellow at the Southern Methodist University Carrot Institute for Engineering Education. A past recipient of the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship, Meagan holds a PhD in engineering education from Purdue University, an MS in electrical engineering from Texas Tech University, and a BS in computer science from Texas Women's University. Meagan began her career playing with light projection on tiny microscopic mirrors as an engineer for Texas Instruments. She now utilizes metaphorical projectors and mirrors to shine a light on micro and macro social systems that, when adjusted, improve student and employee success in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. As an engineer turned educator, Meagan focuses on helping others intentionally engineer inclusion in education and the workforce. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of speaking with Dr. Meagan Pollock. She is the founder and chief inclusion engineer of Engineer Inclusion. Meagan, welcome.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here with you, Pinar.
Thank you so much for making the time. Please tell us more about yourself for our audience.
I like to say I am an engineer turned educator. And this really started a little over a decade ago when I was working in industry and looking for ways to kind of give back to the community. And I taught one of my very first workshops on educational equity. And it was in that moment that I switched from widgets to workshops, and I really haven't looked back. And so since then, I've been doing work on equity and inclusion since about 2009. And so I left industry to go pursue my doctorate in engineering education, really focused on how do we engineer the best engineers, and also engineering environments where women and people of color and other marginalized and minoritized people not only want to be, but feel valued and affirmed, and that they belong in those spaces as well.
I love this so much personally, also because my background is in engineering and I evolved into my life in, I guess, design research, design strategy, and always, connect with engineers who also can speak the language but can really make impact in other areas too. I guess my question on how did this, and you mentioned, you wanted to give back to communities. But what are some of the things that you observed that kind of sparked that interest and really made you passionate to do something about it?
Well, as an engineer yourself, you probably understand some of the things that women experience in industry. um, And so, to be quite honest, it was my experience as a woman in industry. And when I
Yeah.
left industry, I decided I wanted to change the culture of engineering. That I didn't want women or anyone to have to feel some of the things that I experienced. And so that was really the initiating sort of moment. I also wanted to see more people who were like me and like my friends of color who could be in those spaces. And so that was what initiated me. I was really passionate. I want to say engineering is great, right? But there are also some bad things that happen. There are challenging people everywhere, and I just wanted to do everything I can to change that. And then as I got deeper in the work, and my own developing my own social consciousness, it wasn't just about gender. I learned about all of the different intersections of identity and how those affect different people's experiences, and how, all of the systems and institutions of oppression that, in many cases I hadn't even seen because the systems worked for me. It became a real passion of mine to help other people begin to recognize the way that systems of oppression show up, and the ways that we unintentionally are often complicit in upholding those systems that marginalize and continue to exclude people. And so I think, what I love about this work is helping people to have those aha moments of recognizing the ways in which we can, be the change and really initiate effective action. And so helping people to move from just that awareness to key action. So those are some of my motivating
Yeah,
reasons.
I think the moment of like what you experience as a woman in engineering starts in college. At least it started in college for me. At first, like it's the amount of representation, it's just a numbers game, and then you're already feeling a bit lonely. And then from there, it's like the problems I feel like just grow once you like start adding in the interpersonal dynamics and then workplace, and then I think it just accumulates from there. But I love what you mentioned in terms of like sometimes we could be complicit. And I personally had a moment of realization on, I feel like one thing like I did to navigate the system when I was younger and like in college was just to keep your head low, right? Like you don't necessarily but against anybody so that you are in there, so you fit in and so you make friends and meet the culture. And I think one of my biggest realizations as I grew older was realizing, oh, like that didn't help anybody coming after me. And I think that made me a much louder person later on in life about everything around maybe like gender, race, ability, and just talk about it and be an ally to myself and also others personally. But did you ever like, or do you remember what was your first aha moment that in ways that you felt like you might have been, or did you like experience that like around you where people really like with no mean intention like doing something and they're realizing?
Yeah, well, I shared part of the story in my TED talk. People can look it up. It's called How to Be an Inclusive Leader, or How to Become an Inclusive Leader. But I had this really huge realization, this wake up moment after I left industry, of all of the ways in which I was not being myself, I was not being authentic in an effort to survive, right? So like you talked about, and there's no fault to the marginalized, right? Like we internalize these ideas and we're just trying to survive in a space. And so we unconsciously adapt. We unconsciously, assimilate into the culture around us. And that could be different for every team, every company. For me, the team I was on, they were all young, engineers who loved football. And so that meant that I had to live and breathe and watch football more than I ever cared to in my life. Um,
Yeah.
and and that's American football, folks. And so I realized, like, when I left industry, I was like, I don't ever have to watch another football game again. And I was like liberated from this. And you would have never guessed it
Oh
because
man.
I did everything I could to fit in. And I really liken it to like a square peg in a round hole, right? In an effort for me to fit in, because I was gonna do it, gosh darn it, right? Like I was gonna fit in at
Yeah.
all cost. I lost part of myself, right? Like I sort of had to shave the edges off to fit into
Yeah.
this space. And that's what we call, from the literature, that's what we call forced belonging, right? So we're intentional about doing everything that we can to assimilate, to adapt, to fit into these spaces. But what I try to do is to help people, both individuals and organizations, recognize how do we create structural belonging
Right.
so that you can be a square peg in a square hole, right? and that you don't have to
Yeah.
lose part of yourself. You can be any shape peg that you want to be, and there's a shape ready for you to fit in, and there's space for all of us. And so I think that answers your question, but that sort of feeling of
Yeah.
ways that I don't want you to feel like any shame of that, because you were just trying to
I mean,
survive.
I was also
Um,
unaware of the fact that I was
yeah,
doing it too. Like, I think it's so like example like you're giving, you can't force yourself to watch football every time. You believed that you liked football probably after a certain time, like, or like, I don't know, it was like an adoption process that you had to take. But then, um, because I don't know, like you probably can phrase it much better than I do, but it feels like it's like a survival mechanism you develop,
it is.
and that makes you believe that, oh, I like that, oh, this is like what I'm supposed to do, and I'm okay with it until you realize you're not.
Yeah. Well, and to be frank, like, I'm born and raised a Texan. And if anybody knows anything about Texans, we take our football real serious from like, from high school football. So
Yeah.
it was just part of my lived experience. My entire familial culture was to love football. And
Yeah.
then, so there was nothing abnormal about that, right? But one of the things that we actually know to be true is that for people to for people to enter into and persist in spaces that are non-dominant to their identities, it typically means that they've had previous experiences adapting to those environments, right?
Ah.
So when I look at my story, right, I was a competitive power lifter for 18 years. So I was used to being in male dominated spaces. I grew up with two
Mm.
brothers in a sort of very masculine, sort of driven household. So for me to go into engineering, that was just sort of like a normal culture. Whereas
Right.
when we look at how do we create cultures and climates for everyone to enter into and succeed, whereas your past lived experience doesn't dictate whether you feel like you can survive in that kind of environment. That's really the work that I'm doing with pre-college, college, industry organizations, helping them to look at what is the dominant culture in your environment? How do we look at the climate? How do people experience that space? Do they feel belonging? What does that belonging really looks like? Is it forced belonging? How can we institutionalize, and systematize a sort of structural belonging that really
Right.
allows people to show up as their authentic selves? Because the strong will survive, right? But when we look at particularly, in high demand, high tech, high wage jobs,
Yeah.
women and people of color, people who have been consistently and systematically excluded over the course of the profession, they aren't staying in these fields. They're not entering and they're not staying. And
Yeah.
and truth is you and I actually kind of fit these statistics
That's so true. We're
because
examples of it.
we both chose different pathways
Yeah.
as a result.
Yeah, and it's funny because like I feel like I moved from engineering. I did a master's in finance, also very, and then from there, I went into like startups, like serial startups, and finally I'm like in this like architecture and design space where I'm like, okay, like this is like more friendly to just notice like, oh wait, women don't stay in architecture either. Because it's not sustainable for a woman's life cycle, the amount of work and how the culture is and how I guess the real estate industry works in general. And you're kind of just like realizing, wow, this is just a global systemic problem in many 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 industries, and which is not surprising when the system is designed for white male life, right? So in that sense, it shouldn't come as a surprise to see that, oh wait, I don't fit in here either. But at the same time, I feel like there are we're not alone actually in this experience, although like at times, especially earlier on, it felt like quite lonely. And then now I feel like we have a better understanding of, oh, we can do something about it. But I want to talk a little bit more on like, I guess awareness and I guess activation, action are very two different things, right? So there is awareness component. Oh, wait, like that wasn't right. Or like, oh, wait, I was being complicit in like that awareness. And then this both like personally needs to turn into action, and then in an organizational level, it needs to turn into action. So, what are some, I guess, barriers and challenges you're seeing people or organization are facing when they're transitioning into activation?
Yeah, so just to kind of differentiate awareness to action is that awareness is always the first step, right? Like I think that's probably part of these like 10-step programs. You got to
Yeah.
understand the problem first. Um,
Exactly.
but if we understand it and then we do nothing, we are 100% complicit in our part of the issue, right?
Yeah.
And so, a lot of people really have a challenge sort of moving from that awareness to action. And so, one of the things that I love about the work that I do is I take all of the great scholars' work and distill them down into really actionable practical kinds of strategies, trying to create tools that people can employ. And that's from, over a decade in this field of working with educators, because I started in education training teachers, and they'd be like, okay, this is great. So what do I do? And
Yeah.
I'd be like, were we not just in the same room? Like, I just gave you all this beautiful theory. And they're like, no, we need like really turnkey solutions. And so years of sort of trying to hone those really practical tools that people can take, because it's never a function of people not wanting to do it,
Yeah.
but it's really difficult to take all of the knowledge and put it in something really actionable. And so helping people to have those tools and models and roadmaps to really begin to change, because I'm in the business of change. If I didn't believe that people and organizations could change, what's the point of doing this work,
Yeah.
right?
You would
um,
be doing it. Yeah.
and so I think that people, they want to be part of the solution, right? In general, I think that people want to be a part of the solution, but I think that we need to help them. I don't know if you can hear this lovely duck that's outside my window.
Oh, it's okay. I love
um,
it. Joining the podcast. Yeah.
yes, come on. And so it's helping people to take the strategies and really put them into practice, no matter who you are and where you are, whether you're a student, whether you're an educator, whether you're an individual contributor in industry, whether you're a leader, whether you're an executive. All of us can employ these practices. And I always lean back on Stoic philosophy popularized by Stephen Covey, the circles of influence. All of us have things that we can control. All of us have things that we can influence. And then there's a lot, especially when it comes to social justice and equity, that we care about, that we are
Yeah.
concerned about, that we have no control and no influence over. But what I notice so often when people who are sort of just coming into their wokeness, right? So they're just awakening, it's overwhelming, because you think, oh my gosh, I've got to solve all these problems, and like it's
Yeah.
too big. And the answer is yes, it's all the problems, but we are never going to make progress if we get stuck there. So it's
Yeah.
helping people really hone in on like, what can I influence? What can I control? What are those bite-sized pieces and actions that I can take in whatever capacity I serve as an employee, as a human, to
Yeah.
begin to push forth these things. And so so your question was, I think, what are the sort of biggest challenges that people face? And I think it's getting started, right? It's knowing where to
Mm.
start. It's knowing how to then move forward. A lot of things that I also notice is that people can begin to, when you start on this sort of journey of social consciousness and sort of moving from awareness to action, there's a lot that you have to look. It's like walking around with a big mirror and seeing how you move through the world in relation to other people, and that can be ugly. And
Yeah.
it can be scary, and it can not be fun when we have to recognize all the ways in which we've contributed to the oppression of other people, all the ways that we've benefited from a system that excludes and marginalizes other people. Like, that cannot feel good, right? And so what we have to do is learn to push through that discomfort and recognize that, what our positionality is, so our identity in relation to the social context, and then sometimes literally move positions. And that means sometimes that we have to make a choice to get out of the way, right?
Yeah.
That we need to make space for other people to shine, to be included. And, I like the imagery of sort of classic diversity work is like, hey, here's the circle. Let's just jam more people in it so it's diverse, right?
Yeah.
Whereas what we really want to do is sort of just kind of get rid of the circle, right? And just say, let's
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
expand those boundaries like a little amoeba. It's just sort of amorphous. Everybody kind of comes in and out, and everybody gets to show up. And so it's not the square peg round hole thing. It's just like,
Yeah.
hey, there's room for all of us. But as leaders, and again, a leader can be anybody, doesn't have to have manager or power. We have to be paying attention to the culture and climate of every group. If one population is dominating that culture, maybe it's football, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe you're on a team and everybody has young kids and you're the one that doesn't have a kid. But
Yeah.
that's what sort of whatever the culture is. Maybe you're in a team where everyone's really religious and you're not, right? So whatever culture is dominating that space, we have to sort of learn to speak up, and we have to learn how to advocate and say whether we are the one part of that club or
Exactly.
excluded from that club. How are we speaking up and saying, how do we invite and welcome and intentionally include more ways of knowing and doing and being in this space? Because that's when we're
Yeah.
creating structural belonging and we're helping to facilitate the inclusive environments for everyone around us.
I mean, so many of the things you said there like resonated so much, and I love it. Like, first of all, I personally am like as someone like my it was industrial systems engineering, right? And systems view, I've never like to me when I look at like world's problems, it's actually something that's paralyzing, right? So that's like first thing I experienced like personally myself, and then like over time really educating myself and like, okay, engineer, one is greater than zero, and we can like do one step at a time rather than being paralyzed in like the systems view. But that definitely I definitely experienced that in the past. And what you mentioned also in terms of like the challenges that people like face in the change, is I guess like number one, like synthesis, right? Like all that knowledge and research that you mentioned, like what is the actionable insights out coming out of that anyway? So your work in like really providing support and guidance in that is so meaningful, because I feel like in any field, really, in innovation or in education, like really landing on the insights, well, first of all, that are inclusive, is also challenging, and really like being able to identify the first step from there and being able to show a roadmap seems to be, because once people onboard it, it's likely that efforts will come, but that onboarding initially is like seems to be like very challenging in many different areas as well. And I definitely you know see the tremendous value that you're bringing in, sort of like making helping people and organizations take that first step. And also, I guess like what you mentioned in terms of like how the boundaries should look like, representation is not necessarily inclusion, right? Like just because, and that's generally the first step, like let's hire people, which is great, and it's the first step. But then to your point, if the culture is not inclusive, if the workplace is not inclusive, then people don't stay, right? They might actually be even more traumatized than they leave. And to your point, like recognizing the continuous work around it, and inclusion very much being not only like, hey, we're a mix, but really just like recognizing the life, the habits, the cultures, the behaviors around humans. And to your point, what you were saying in terms of positionality, I think that's just like common work, which is common sense, right? Like to remain healthy, we need to continue to exercise, right? Like that we understand. I think there's a lot of, and we see this in like sustainability agendas too, like approach, like have a project based approach sometimes to things, where sometimes it's like, okay, this is great, but this feels a little bit one off. Like what's happening next? Like really, I feel like helping people and organizations understand that this is a work that continually needs to be massaged, right? Like I probably have things that I'm doing wrong still. I don't know. I'll continue to learn. But I think we have to, now that we're seeing more like efforts and interest in representation and inclusion, I think we also need to recognize the ongoing path and journey, and each like mini steps in between too, so that it also doesn't feel like, okay, this is our 2050 vision. That's it. No agenda or strategy around it, but really identifying all those like mini steps that should be happening in between. And really, similar to how we like accept this as a common norm in like exercising or just, keeping a healthy diet. I think we have to like almost internalize that in the same way that this is ongoing work and need of ongoing awareness and education too.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. This is a journey. We're never done. All of us are going to continue to do shit that hurts other people unintentionally. And we just have to learn to one to recognize it, right? So having some cognitive self-regulation, some deep self-awareness practices. I love Tasha Urich's work on self-awareness. Her book is called Insight. So I like read it once a year because I think that there's a lot of alignment between being self-aware and recognizing who you are and how you function as a leader. I have a ton of resources on my website on inclusive leadership, and so it's recognizing how do I begin to employ these practices for the inclusive leader model. And I think most importantly is to give yourself grace, right? So when you recognize, just like for your health, right? Say that you have a cheat day that went wrong, right?
A lot
Sometimes you
of
just
croissants in Barcelona, chocolate croissants.
so sometimes you just have to give yourself a little grace and keep moving. You don't throw the baby out with bathwater, like you just got to keep moving. And especially again when you're increasing that social consciousness and social awareness, we just have to keep moving forward. And again, like you said, employing one thing at a time, because again, it is very overwhelming. That's why I really like to create tools. Hey, try this tool that you bring up in your meeting. It can take 5 minutes, right? Bring this up, and this sort of creates a shared vocabulary where everybody can to learn to think about these things. And then when we employ lots of these little kinds of practices, it's building everyone's social consciousness. And when you have this shared vocabulary, it allows you to build an accountability of like, hey, like, let's think about this. How does this fit into the cognitive biases? Are we playing to this? Are we practicing stewardship? Are we practicing inclusive leadership? Are we, are we adhering to our sort of group norms? And I've got some sample group norms that you can use on my website that employ inclusive practices. So any kind of sort of tool takeaway that people can start to try, right? And because that's really what's going to help us begin to think about these things, particularly for people who are from dominant groups. So for me, even though I am a woman and I have experienced marginalization in engineering, I'm still a white woman who has benefited from systems. And so it makes it, as I said in the beginning, it makes it really hard for people who have benefited from a system to see the barriers that others face, because the system works for you, right?
Exactly.
And so to me, it's like building sort of Superman X-ray vision. Like I have to build this. Yeah, I have to build this muscle and this practice. And it is a practice because it means I have to look at everything that I'm doing. I have to look through the system and say, or the project, or whatever it is that you're doing, who is this serving? Who is this not serving? Whose voice is present? Whose voice is not present? Who feels like they belong? Who doesn't feel like they belong? So it's this practice, this exercise of asking these kinds of questions that help me begin to understand that system. Because if I don't ask those questions, if I just keep moving through the world, I'm just going to replicate a world based on the system that works for me, right? And so again, that makes me complicit, and I don't want to be complicit. So even though I absolutely am all the time, but it's again that practice of how am I employing these skills? How am I bringing in and honoring other ways of knowing and doing and being, and not just perpetuating the ways in which I was conditioned to think, you know?
Right,
So,
right. No, I love it, and it also makes me think about, um, like the approach that you're sharing is also almost like a need for the culture to change, right? Like really almost prototyping solutions, right? Like what works for this group, what doesn't, really experimenting things and not being afraid to try. I feel like, while this is like very common practice in maybe tech space, it's not necessarily in many other fields, which is why it's also much slower in change and really like catching up on some of the change that is much needed. And I think this like even like approaching, and that's why I also love like the toolkit that you have and like that idea. It's almost like it's safe to fail. Like it may not work, but like try this or like try this, right? So like it gives this agility to teams and approachability actually to even like the proposal that you have. It's not like, okay, like we're doing this like mega project. It's like, let's start here and then let's start here and like slowly tackle. And what we love, and because we do these like episodes a lot and we have a lot of intersectionalities and like solutions and the changes that we need to see, right? And one is like collaboration. We really need like diverse collaborations to address many of the problems in the world. We need like bottom up and top down solutions to like work together. And like I'm hearing from you also like, well, number one, we need to acknowledge the problem. We need to be aware, right? So it actually reflects to any systemic issue, right? For us to, and this is, you're saying, for you to constantly practice. And again, our reference to exercising, right? Like working the muscle to really pick up on things and notice things. And if you don't do that, it's also easier to miss because we are conditioned in a certain way because of our own positionality. So I think it's quite a universal need in many systemic issues, like really working the muscle to like understand, be in self-check, being self-aware. And these other things that we talked about also could support this, right? If you do diverse collaborations, it is probably easier for you to hold yourself accountable because you have diverse perspectives at the table. So in that sense, we love like seeing these kind of like overarching like needs we need to see in like solutions. And I think like my biggest takeaway from today is like also like, well, step one, acknowledge awareness and acknowledgement, right? Like we need to start there in order to even like discuss about action.
well, I wanted to add, so just last week I was in Illinois at the University of Illinois working with a group of educators, and we used Stanford's D School empathic design process mixed with human-centered design models. And we had the Center for Human-Centered Design there at University of Illinois come in and work with the teachers. And so we're teaching them now, again, they're teaching they're trying to create equitable and inclusive STEM clubs. And
Mm,
so engineering focused STEM clubs, but we use that as a model. And we have a little video that we put together a few months ago for the National Science Foundation that talked about what we did last year with this group and how important it is to really start with that empathy and to start with that and that design model, because you're right, it gives people that space to say, hey, this is an iterative process, we're trying new things, we're testing and adapting. And I use process improvement models, which again are really closely tied to design models of what does the data tell us, how do we understand the problem, and then how do we create hypotheses by understanding root causes, and then how do we look at those root causes, test them and validate them. Because so
yeah.
often when we're trying to create change is I could come sit here and think, okay, the problem is they need this.
Yeah.
Well, if I never actually stop to ask and do a little bit of research to determine that, I could spend so much time and money and resources and create this beautiful intervention that doesn't actually address a problem, right? And
Yeah.
so that's one of the things I love doing with organizations and clients, because that's so close to my engineering training, and using that sort of process improvement and those data-driven approaches. And why it's also valuable is because a lot of times the hypotheses that we create are wrong.
Mm-hmm.
By testing those, now we've saved ourselves lots of time, money, and resources and effort that would
Yes.
have been wasted, right? On maybe a fun project that just gave some people some feel good moments, but like didn't actually.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, so we can use all of these good design thinking principles and use these engineering models, process improvement to help us create change. And to me, that is the solution to this. It's not just the
Right.
one-off things, it's how are we
Yeah.
systematically approaching this?
Yeah.
Because when I teach people process improvement, my goal is to teach them a process, and then they can keep iterating it and doing it, once I'm gone, right? Because just with any kind of design thinking, you're trying to get them to keep iterating and keep moving and keep asking those questions and keep looking at the data, to truly understand the problem.
Exactly. And I love, the approach you're also presenting is diverse mixed methods, right? Like in the end, there also like the diversity is really addressing the need. And also, I think, we often discuss about, process usually, especially in the field of design, doesn't get that much glory, right? We have these like money shots in the end, and that's generally the focus. Like to your point, people want the success, like that last minute of attachment. But what is scalable in like world's problems, I think, is like a process, right? Like we could actually look at like some methods and approaches that we could scale into different things. And I think it is great that you highlight that and really like looking into process a bit more and thinking of maybe innovations and interventions in the process rather than like the beauty shot in the
Yeah.
end.
So I
um,
have a really quick acronym that can help
yeah.
people. So in order for us to drive change, here's what we got to do. We got to look at the data, do root cause analysis, and then from there, look at what's actually happening, conduct an analysis to get more data. I is for interventions. What strategies will address those root causes, implement the intervention. V is validation. So this is where we're formatively assessing our progress as we're moving through, and then E is evaluation. This is where we're summatively assessing the outcomes, and then again iterate back. How are we driving change? So data, root causes, interventions, validation, and evaluation. So there's a little
Boom. I love
process.
that. That's going to be the name of the podcast. We're going to do like drive. That was great. I do want to be mindful of time, so I'm going to jump to our last part, which
Okay.
is I know you sprinkled many of those in throughout our like conversation, but if you were to give someone advice, they could be an engineer, designer, whatever, like going into space, they want to do something different or make progress. What would be your advice to them?
If we're talking to students, I always tell students to own your education. And
Mm.
I this could go for all of us, to own your life, own your future. Nobody's looking out for you in the way that you are. And to really learn to craft and curate the experience that you want. For me as a student through all three of my degrees, I upset all of my professors because I did not do what I was told. But in the end, I'm like a poster child for them. They're like, oh, look at, Dr. Pollock. But I'm like, y'all weren't so supportive when I was there, right? But the point is like, it's your education, it's your life, it's your career. Even as I've moved through my career, after school, and really trying to craft and curate things, the life, the experiences that I want, we have to drive those, right? So we'll talk, driving the
Yeah.
opportunities, driving the change. And then connecting this back to equity is that, to equity and inclusion, is that we have to own the spaces that we're part of, right? We have to own the way in which we engage in those, and learning to speak up, learning to, address inequities is really hard. And so we have to learn to practice and learn to have those hard conversations. For any of us, when power is at play, when we are not the one in power, or when there is risk to us, that can be really scary. But learning to have that vocabulary, listening to podcasts, listening to following people that you respect on Twitter, who or however you get information, reading books, certainly, even great documentaries. It's learning to have that language and that confidence and that courage to really speak up and say what needs to be said. And so that's my advice. I know it seems harder said than done, but like our exercise example here is, it's a muscle. You don't just wake up one day with all of the strength and power to speak truth to power. But that's something that we can start practicing. So whether it's for your education and what you want to do, whether it's for the team that you're on, all of us can learn to speak up and address the challenges. And that means that we need to, we're not giving voice to anyone, because everyone has a voice. Their voice may have just been excluded. But we are trying to make space for other people's ways of knowing and doing and being, to be honored, valued, and elevated. So that's my advice.
I love that so much. Owning experiences. I wish somebody told me that when I was in college. Thank you for sharing that for all our listeners and for myself. This was such a treat, Meagan. Thank you so much for making the time for us.
Yeah, Pinar, thank you so much. It was a lot of fun to talk with you.
Thank you.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.